Hi everyone, and welcome to the March tutorial of Alice. So like I always do in every single composite is I start by making a new file. My files are always usually a portrait style and between 4,000 and 5,000 pixels, which is typically an 8x10 size. Once I have my new file, I will start dropping in the background that I want to use for the picture. So for this one, I wanted to have that door like in Alice in Wonderland, the movie, where she goes through the keyhole in the bottle. And so that's why I found like this really cool door and started with that. For the floor, because I wanted to keep those little lamps in the image on the side of the door, for the floor, I did have to use the content aware scale to fill in the rest of the background. So here I am just selecting the floor, and then I will go up to edit, transform, and content aware scale. And then what you do is you just pull it down to the bottom and it will fill that in with the floor. So when I was done doing that content aware scale, I noticed it wasn't large enough to fill the entire floor. So I just rescaled that layer so that it would be large enough to cover everything. I then decided I didn't love the idea of the lights being completely cut out. So I just put a layer mask on the floor layer and painted that part back in so that I would be able to keep the door a little more distance and keep those lamps in the image as well. Alright, so once I got the floor fixed, I decided that I wanted to change the perspective of the door just slightly. So I went to edit, transform, and perspective and just kind of pinched in the sides on the top and brought the bottom out a bit just so that it looks like we're looking up at the door, because I want it to look large compared to the size of our subject once I get her in there. So I wanted to look like we were looking upwards towards the door, and that's why I changed the perspective there. All right, so after I got the perspective fixed, I just merged the two background layers and then started bringing in the water backgrounds. So I chose quite a few just so that I had kind of a different wave to it. There's quite a few layers to the water actually, so I will kind of go a little more detail into how I worked these. All right, so the first thing I wanted to do was remove the white background of this. So I at first tried the remove background in the preferences palette, but it didn't quite work very well. So what I did is I went back and did, if you go to select and then select color range, and then you put the little eyedropper on the white and it's going to select the white. And you can also just like bring back the part of the water that's kind of missing there and remove the white background in that way. So I just used my lasso tool to bring back the parts that were selected in the water, and then you can just remove the white background and drag and drop that layer into your image that you're working on. Once you have your layer dropped into your background, you want to turn that to a smart object. So you just right click and then click on convert to smart object before you resize it, just so you don't have any distortion and odd things happening there. So for this part, I'm really just looking at the surface of the water, and I'm going to color out the bottom of it and just use the surface of the water for these ones. And then I would bring a different layer for the underwater part in. So I'm just going to speed up this process a little bit of me just kind of rearranging the water bits, and then we'll get back into it. All right, so once I got the surface of the water fixed up, I dropped in the underwater layer, and it's got the light shining in under the water, and I just brought that in and, you know, play around with the layer masks to paint out the part that's kind of coming up over the surface there. And then I brought in a second underwater layer, which kind of has like watery, like bubbles and texture and stuff like that. I'm just kind of looking through all of the different blending modes to see if there's something that works good for the underwater. You definitely want to see the wall and the floor shining through the water. I was thinking I would do overlay, but it changed the color of the water too much and made it too dark. So I just put it back onto normal, and then I played around with the opacity of the layer. I still want that kind of like misty, foggy underwater texture, and so doing that with the normal layer and then just lowering the opacity gave you that look a lot better. And then I brought in the particle water layer that had the kind of water texture. And again, I played around with the the blending modes, but I still didn't get the look I wanted. So I just stuck with normal and then lowered the opacity. I think the opacity I turned down to about 20%. On the background layer, I added a color balance layer and just clipped it to that layer, the background layer. And I added some magenta in there because I found the background was a little too green, a little bit of cyan, and then a little bit of yellow just to balance that color and match it a bit more to the water. And then I decided that the perspective just needed to be changed a little bit more to make the door a bit more large. So I went up to edit, transform, and then perspective, and again just kind of pinched the top corners together and pulled out the bottom corners slightly to make the door look a bit larger. Okay, and then the last water piece I brought in was this reflection off the top of the water, because if the sunlight is going to be hitting the water surface, it will reflect that light. So I wanted to add that to the walls. And then I just added, again, another color balance layer to this one. First I played with the blending modes. I put it as an overlay and then just lowered the opacity to make it look more like a reflection on the walls. And here I am just adding that color balance layer. I clipped it to that water layer only. And because I wanted it to look like sunlight reflecting off, I made it just slightly warmer, adding more red and more magenta and more yellow into it, just slightly. So at this point, I started placing my pixel squid stock, but then realized I wasn't quite finished with the water stock yet. So what I wanted to add in the front was those bubbles. And so if you imagine what water looked like pressed up against glass, you would have a pretty thick line and maybe some bubbles and things like that. So I wanted to have that line, and so I found something from Adobe Stock, this one right here, that had that line. And now I'm just going to select that bit out and drop that into my my other picture. Alright, so once I had it selected out, I just used the puppet warp tool. So you go to transform, you go to edit, and then just above the transform tool there is something called puppet warp, and I warped the line to match the original water edge or the top of the water that I added in. All right, and then I went and found another similar photo of the bubble and water line and did the exact same thing, selected it out, and then dropped it into my other image. All right, so this is the original jar that I had chosen, but later I was looking at it and a mason jar didn't make sense. I needed something a little more like a little drinking jar, so I ended up scrapping this idea and finding something else in Pixel Squid. So here's where I had brought my daughter in and I changed up the jar from Pixel Squid. Then I decided that the water needed to be flipped the other direction because the light source was actually coming in from the other side. So I had to swap it a little bit there. There's like 3 different light sources in this one. There's the 2 lamps as well as a window light that is coming in from the left. And so I had the water the wrong direction at first. And so I just flipped it horizontally. So at this point, I just started dropping in all of the Pixel Squid stock, and I made a light box specifically for Alice themed things that I was going to use for this picture. So I'm just going to speed up this part of the process because it's going to be the same the entire way through. So once I pick the photo I'm going to use from Pixel Squid, I turn off the shadows and I make the subject a high resolution, and then I'm just going to hit Control T and resize them to how I want them to be for the image. So there are a couple of pieces of stock here that I added in that are not from Pixel Squid. The Cheshire Cat and the Drink Me tag was from stock, from Adobe stock. So all I did with those was I went in, I clicked on the Preferences tab, those 3 little buttons, and I said remove background for those, and then just dropped those in, and I cleaned up the selection when it was in the finished photo. All right, so here I am painting the roses red. So I just took a color layer. So I went to my adjustments palette and added a solid color. And then I clipped that solid color to one of the roses. And then I just painted on where I thought I wanted the paint splashes to be on the roses. And I did have some stock images of dripping paint that I brought in and just put kind of along the edge of the rose. All right, so I didn't finish all of the roses. I just did one at this point, but I decided to finish cleaning up the water and blending those a bit better here. And then I realized that I needed water in behind that table. Otherwise, it's not gonna look like there's water back there, and we want it to have a little bit more depth so it looks like it's up against the wall. And so I brought in another piece of stock with like water surface to put in there. We needed an undersurface of the water, so I did bring in another piece of stock just to get that water level underneath the bubble layer that I did. And then I just adjusted the color balance of each of these layers to match them together to that blue color. And some of them are kind of looking a little teal, so I had to darken them up, and I used a brightness and contrast adjustment layer to do that. So on each of these water layers, I'm adding the brightness and contrast adjustment layer as well as the color balance adjustment layer, just so I can get them matching one another and looking like it's one cohesive piece of water and not a bunch of little separate stock pieces. So here I am adding that underwater layer, and I'm just bringing in selections of a piece of stock that I used and painting those in so that it looks like you can see under the water a little bit when those waves pop up. So in the spot where it's kind of dipping down, I don't have an underwater layer, but when there's a wave kind of going upwards, you would be able to see a underwater layer, and so that's why I'm adding it just in those specific places. So I did add a solid color layer of blue to that underwater just to darken it up a little bit, as well as the specks of water have a blue tone to it just to kind of match the color. All right, so for each piece of stock that is underwater, it would have a blue tone to it. So on each of those pieces of stock, I'm bringing a hue and saturation layer up and adding blue into each of the pieces. And then I am adding a shadow layer and a highlight layer on each of these as well. And on the shadow layer, you want to turn that to multiply, and on the highlight layer, you want to turn that to overlay. And with a dark color, like a dark blue, you want to paint in those shadows where you think the light will be casting a shadow onto that particular item. And then same with the highlights, but with a white paintbrush, you're going to paint in the highlights where the light would be hitting those pieces. All right, so for this part, I slowed it down so you could see what I was doing with the shadow and highlight layers. So on top of the background layer, the wall and the door, I added 2 new layers. I changed one of those layers blending modes to multiply, and the second layer's blending mode to overlay. And on that multiply layer, I'm going to select with my brush a really dark blue from a shadowy area in the water, and I'm going to paint that on with a low opacity brush between 5 and 10%, and I'm just going to build that shadow up on the wall where the light wouldn't really be touching. All right, and for this next part, I'm going to select the kind of a white yellowy color for the light on the overlay layer, and I'm going to do the same thing with a soft low opacity brush. I'm going to paint the light in and kind of where I think the sunlight would be touching the wall and the background. Basically want to build up a little bit more in behind those lights, because the light they would be casting light against the wall, so that's what I'm doing here. I'm just adding a little bit more of those highlights and painting off the shadow that I painted on just in behind those lights, so that I can so that you know that that light is giving off more light to the background. And I'm just going to show you guys here the before and after of those highlights and shadows on the background. It really makes a big difference adding those. All right, so now I'm just gonna go through each stock layer and clean up any edges that I need to. With this drink tag, it would be casting a reflection on the bottle. So once I got the layer mask cleaned up, I just made flattened it and then made a copy of it and put it underneath the drink tag and just put the opacity down and put a bit of a Gaussian blur on it so that it would have that reflection on the bottle. And then painted in the shadows and highlights the same way I did the walls on each piece of stock. Okay, and here I am just cleaning up the flowers and finishing those up and adding those paint splashes from Pixel Squid in on each rose. Yeah, it was a lot of fun kind of playing around with those paint splashes And yeah, I had a lot of fun working on this image. Some people might think I'm crazy because I go as much detail with the shadow and highlights on every piece of stock, including those vines that I put on the walls. Yes, it did take a while to paint in all of those shadows on the walls, but to make it look realistic, it kind of needs to be done. Okay, and after I got all those shadows in, I needed to paint in the highlights, so I then went in and added those highlights there. And I chose the kind of yellowy tone because the lamps would be casting that yellow tone. The Cheshire Cat was a lot of fun. I added a color layer to make his eyes look like he's glowing and painted some of his tail away and blended it in so that it looked like it was kind of fading out. I love that character so much. All right, and then I just finished up doing the highlights and shadows on the rest of the stock, and I sped that up for you guys so you don't have to sit there and watch hours. Once I got the rest of the highlight and shadows done on the other stock pieces, I got to work on the selection of my daughter's photograph. And so I just cleaned up the edges, and then here what I'm doing is drawing in some hair because, as you can see, the selection didn't select her hair very well. And so on a new paint layer just underneath the Alice layer of my subject, I'm painting in with a 1% paintbrush at 100% opacity, or like between 50 and 100%. You can always change the opacity of your layer, but I'm just kind of drawing in and building up. And it does take a while to do this, but I'm just building up the hair around her, maybe making some little wisps on the side, and yeah, doing that all around her hairline. When I get the hair finished, then I want to add the highlight and shadow layers on my subject. So again, one layer will be on multiply for the shadows, and the second layer will be on overlay for the highlights. All right, and so on top of the highlight layer, I also want to add like a color layer because these lamps are giving off a warm tone. I want to paint that warm tone in. So on top of my highlight and shadow layers, I'm adding and clipping a solid color layer to my subject, and I'm going to play around with the blending modes so that I can paint in that color tone. Looks like I chose overlay, and you can turn the opacity down because you want it just to be a little bit of light. Invert that layer mask, and then with a soft white brush, you're going to paint that back in. You can also play around with the opacity of your brush. Typically, I'll paint things in like this at around 10 to 20%, depending on how strong you want that color cast to be. Okay, and here's a little before and after of those highlight and shadow layers on my subject. And again, just like we saw with the wall, it makes a huge difference. All right, and the last finishing touch that we want to do on our subject is make it look like those fingers are actually pressing up against the glass of our bottle. So how I did that was I brought her up into the liquify, and there's a bloat tool in there that I made very small, and I just bloated out her fingers a little bit to make it look like the palms of her fingers were flat. And then what I decided to do was go in, and on that highlight layer, I highlighted them, made them a little whiter because they would be brighter pushed up against the glass like that. And I took the shadows that I painted on some of them off as well on the shadow layer. And yeah, you can see the difference that makes, and it actually looks like her fingers are pushed up against the glass. And with a bubble brush, I just went in with like a blue color and painted in some bubbles around the stock in the water. And you can find the bubble brushes anywhere. Brush Easy has tons of them and they're free, so definitely check out that website. And I just made a few adjustments on where stock was placed here. And then I made some adjustments with the lighting once again, adding that highlight on the bottle. And then after that, once I get all the shading and highlights finished on each piece of stock, I then will go in and add a little bit of definition. So because I want the wall and all of those things to be a little more behind my subject, I'm adding a bit of Gaussian blur on each piece of stock. And depending on how far away I want it to look. So with these ones, the wall's pretty close still, so maybe I was putting them at about 1% each. Adding that Gaussian blur here, and then once I get the Gaussian blur added in, I will add a bit of noise, especially to the Pixel Squid stock, because they are quite sharper than what some of our cameras can pick up. So a lot of the time our cameras will have grain on them, but with the Pixel Squids, they're very sharp, and so adding that grain will help blend it in. So that's what I'm doing here. I'll usually just put it at about 1%, but depending on how grainy either some of your other stock from Adobe is or the pictures that you took, you want it to kind of match up, so you can adjust the noise that you need added on to each stock as you go. So once you finish putting all your Gaussian blur and noise on each piece of your stock, you are done your image. So I had a ton of fun working on this tutorial with you guys, and I'm excited to do the new April one. So I will see you then. Bye.
Bye.
Say goodbye.
Goodbye, besties.